Incompetent fool! That roar ripped through the Greasy Spoon Diner, courtesy of Richard Sterling, coffee dripping from his bespoke suit. Annalise, mortified, scrambled for napkins, knowing her minimum wage wouldn't cover dry cleaning, let alone a lawsuit. Gus, the owner, was already apoplectic. But the real shocker? It wasn't Richard's fury. It was his mother, Beatrice, the Sterling matriarch. She wasn't looking at the coffee stain. Her diamond-sharp gaze was locked on Annalise's forearm just above the burn. An old scar shimmered faintly there. They didn't know it, but that mark, it wasn't just a birth defect. It was a damn bloodline, and Beatrice Sterling knew it. They have no idea how her quiet kindness will change everything. Incompetent fool! That roar ripped through the Greasy Spoon Diner, courtesy of Richard Sterling, coffee dripping from his bespoke suit. Annalise, mortified, scrambled for napkins, knowing her minimum wage wouldn't cover dry cleaning, let alone a lawsuit. Gus, the owner, was already apoplectic. But the real shocker? It wasn't Richard's fury. It was his mother, Beatrice, the Sterling matriarch. She wasn't looking at the coffee stain. Her diamond-sharp gaze was locked on Annalise's forearm, just above the burn. An old scar shimmered faintly there. They didn't know it, but that mark? It wasn't just a birth defect. It was a damn bloodline. And Beatrice Sterling knew it. They have no idea how her quiet kindness will change everything. Annalise Parker knew the smell of the Daily Grind diner like her own skin, a potent cocktail of sizzling bacon, stale coffee, and quiet desperation. At 24, she moved through the cramped space with a practiced weariness, her movements economical, born of years spent navigating this greasy labyrinth. The faded blue polyester of her uniform clung to her, a second skin that hid secrets as effectively as it concealed the weariness etched onto her face. She plastered on a smile, a reflex against the indifference of customers who often saw her as nothing more than a pair of hands delivering their artery-clogging breakfasts. Her tips were a lifeline, not just for her, but for Daniel, her 16-year-old brother. While other kids his age worried about football games and flirting, Daniel battled cystic fibrosis, a relentless disease that choked his lungs and drained their meager savings. Doctors' appointments were a constant, a bleak punctuation in their already difficult lives. Each cough was a hammer blow against Annalise's heart, each hospital bill a step closer to financial ruin. Every extra shift, every skipped meal, went into a fund for an experimental treatment, a fragile hope against the overwhelming odds. Tuesday's lunchtime rush hit with the force of a tidal wave. The diner vibrated with the clatter of cutlery, shouted orders, and the insistent hiss of the grill. Annalise danced between tables, balancing a precarious tower of plates and mugs, her mind a finely tuned algorithm of orders and destinations. Then, the bell above the door chimed. The noise itself wasn't unusual, but the group that stepped inside, they were an anomaly. It was the Sterlings. Even if you'd never seen their faces plastered across magazines or watched them pontificate on cable news, you couldn't miss them. An aura of money and power, thick as the diner's grease, clung to them. Leading the charge was Beatrice Sterling, the matriarch, a woman whose age was betrayed only by the delicate web of lines around eyes that could cut glass. Her silver hair was impeccably coiffed, and her cobalt blue Chanel suit probably cost more than Annalise's beat-up Corolla. Beside her strode Richard Sterling, the CEO of Sterling Industries. He inherited his mother's sharp features, but twisted into a perpetual frown. He scanned the diner with undisguised disdain, as if fearing contamination. Trailing behind, looking like a deer caught in headlights, was his wife, Catherine, her elegant face pale with anxiety. Bringing up the rear was a man whose dark suit and grim expression marked him as security. The diner fell silent. Forks clattered to plates. Conversation stuttered and died. Gus, his face slick with grease, scurried out from behind the grill. Mrs. Sterling, Mr. Sterling, what an honor. We weren't expecting you. He stammered, his apron stained with a history of culinary mishaps. Our driver had a flat tire, Richard said, his voice clipped, each word a precisely aimed dart. My mother required a place to sit and a cup of tea. This was the closest establishment. He infused the word with a palpable distaste. Beatrice, however, offered a small, enigmatic smile. Nonsense, Richard. A change of scenery can be invigorating. She gestured toward the window. A booth by the window, if you please. Gus nearly tripped over himself, clearing the best booth, wiping the vinyl with frantic energy. Annalise's heart hammered against her ribs. This was her section. This was it. The table that could make or break her day, maybe even her week. A massive tip or utter disaster. Parker, you're up, Gus hissed, his eyes wide with panic. Don't screw this up. Quick, polite. Don't speak unless spoken to. Taking a shaky breath, Annalise grabbed her pad and approached the table, focusing on the scuffed formica. Good afternoon. Can I start you off with some beverages? She asked, her voice miraculously steady. Hot water with lemon, Beatrice commanded softly. Black coffee, Richard grunted, already engrossed in his phone. Just water for me, please, Catherine murmured, avoiding eye contact. Annalise retreated to the counter, her hands trembling slightly. She prepared the drinks with meticulous care, each movement deliberate, each action amplified by her nerves. This was it. $100 could mean a week of groceries, $200, Daniel's copay for his next specialist visit. The possibilities danced in her head, a fragile, shimmering mirage. She returned to the table, her focus razor sharp, her senses heightened. Placing the hot water before Beatrice, the water for Catherine, she turned to Richard, coffee in hand. Suddenly, a child from a nearby booth, chasing a runaway toy truck, slammed into her leg. The world tilted. Annalise felt the tray lurch, a sickening lurch that mirrored the churning in her stomach. The mug of black coffee slipped, arced through the air, and crashed onto the table. Hot liquid splashed, spraying across Richard's pristine trousers, onto the crisp white tablecloth, and directly onto Annalise's exposed forearm. A sharp gasp tore from her throat, a mixture of pain and abject horror. Incompetent fool! Richard roared, leaping to his feet and furiously brushing at his ruined suit. I'm so sorry, sir. It was an accident, Annalise stammered, tears stinging her eyes. She grabbed a handful of napkins, frantically dabbing at the mess, her mind racing. Fired. She was definitely fired. Gus would kill her, but it wasn't Richard's fury or Gus's incandescent rage that froze the room. It was Beatrice Sterling. The matriarch hadn't moved. She wasn't focused on the coffee-soaked table or her apoplectic son. Her gaze was locked with unnerving intensity on Annalise's forearm. In the chaos, the sleeve of Annalise's uniform had ridden up, exposing skin. The coffee had left an angry red mark, but it was the faint, silvery scar beneath that captured Beatrice's attention. A peculiar shape, like a stylized bird or a crescent moon with a single delicate feather branching off. A birthmark, something Annalise had always hidden out of a vague sense of shame. Time seemed to warp and bend. The sounds of the diner faded into a muted hum. Beatrice Sterling slowly raised a hand, her perfectly manicured finger trembling slightly as she pointed directly at Annalise's arm. Her face, moments ago a mask of aristocratic composure, was now a canvas of raw, unbridled shock. Her lips parted, and a choked whisper filled the stunned silence. That mark, Beatrice breathed, her voice cracking with an emotion no one could decipher. That mark, it runs in our family. Richard stopped dabbing at his suit, his face contorting in confusion. Catherine looked up, her eyes wide with bewilderment. Gus stood frozen by the counter, his mouth agape. Annalise could only stare, first at the familiar scar on her arm, then at the billionaire matriarch who was staring back as if she had just seen a ghost. In that moment, the cracked coffee cup on the floor was forgotten, overshadowed by the shattering of a reality Annalise Parker had never even known existed. The immediate aftermath was a whirlwind of hushed urgency. The Sterling security detail, a stoic man named Samuel, swiftly and discreetly settled the bill with Gus, leaving a tip so exorbitant it could have covered the diner's rent. Richard, still sputtering with indignation, but clearly rattled by his mother's behavior, steered her toward the door, where a sleek black Bentley materialized, its tire miraculously repaired. "Mother, this is absurd," he hissed, his voice low but sharp. "She's a clumsy waitress. It's a coincidence, A tattoo, anything. You're making a scene. Beatrice ignored him. Her eyes, filled with a storm of emotions Annalise couldn't begin to interpret, remained fixed on the young woman. "What is your name, child?" she asked, her voice regaining some of its authority, though a tremor remained. "Annalise. Annalise Parker." "Ma'am," she whispered, her own arm still throbbing from the burn. "Annalise?" Beatrice repeated the name, tasting it on her tongue. Foreign yet strangely familiar. She turned to Samuel. "Get her contact information. We will be in touch." And just like that, they were gone. The bell above the door chimed their departure, leaving behind a silence thick with unanswered questions and the lingering scent of expensive perfume. Annalise stood, motionless, wet napkins clutched in her hand, her world tilted on an axis she didn't recognize. Gus, after staring at the 5 crisp $100 bills Samuel had left, simply told Annalise to take the rest of the day off, his usual gruffness replaced by a stunned reverence. Annalise walked home in a daze, the cacophony of the city a dull hum in her ears. She lived in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment in Queens, a world away from the Sterling's Upper East Side existence. The building smelled of damp carpets and stale cabbage, a stark contrast to the Chanel No. 5 that had wafted from Beatrice Sterling. She found Daniel on the sofa, a textbook open on his lap, his breathing a little more labored than usual. He looked up as she entered, his bright, intelligent eyes clouded with worry. "You're home early," he said, his voice raspy. "Is everything okay?" How could she possibly explain that a billionaire matriarch thought a scar on her arm was some kind of family crest? It sounded like the plot of a bad soap opera. She was too tired for fairy tales, so she just shook her head and forced a weak smile. "Just a slow day. How are you feeling?" The call came the next morning, shattering the fragile normalcy she had tried to construct. It was a woman with a crisp British accent who identified herself as Beatrice Sterling's personal assistant. She politely but firmly requested Annalise's presence at Sterling Manor in Greenwich, Connecticut that afternoon. A car would be sent for her. It was not a request. Panic and a dizzying sense of curiosity warred within her. This was insane. A mistake. A cruel prank. A delusion of a wealthy old woman. Yet a small, desperate part of her, the part that still dared to dream of a life beyond stained aprons and crushing medical bills, felt a flicker of impossible hope. For Daniel's sake, she had to go. The car that arrived was the same black Bentley. The leather seats were softer than any bed she had ever slept in. As the car sped out of the city and into the manicured landscapes of Connecticut, Annalise felt like she was shedding her old life, mile by mile. Sterling Manor wasn't a house. It was a kingdom, a sprawling stone mansion that rose from acres of perfectly sculpted gardens. It looked more like a European palace than a private residence. A butler with an impeccably straight back greeted her at the door and led her through halls adorned with classical paintings and centuries-old antiques. The sheer scale of the wealth was suffocating. Every vase, every rug, every ornate chandelier was a testament to a level of existence so far removed from her own, it felt like a different planet. She was shown into a vast drawing room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a serene lake. Beatrice Sterling was waiting for her, seated in a high-backed armchair near an unlit fireplace. Richard stood by the window, arms crossed, his expression a thundercloud of suspicion. Catherine was perched nervously on the edge of a silk-covered sofa. "Miss Parker, thank you for coming," Beatrice said, her voice calm and measured. "Please sit." Annalise sat stiffly, her hands clenched in her lap. She felt small and shabby in her best jeans and a faded blouse. "My behavior yesterday was abrupt," Beatrice began. "I apologize for any distress it may have caused you, but you must understand, my reaction was not without reason." She paused, her gaze drifting to Annalise's arm, which she had instinctively covered. "May I see it again? The mark on your arm." Hesitantly, Annalise pushed up her sleeve. In the soft afternoon light, the scar seemed more prominent, its silvery lines catching the light. Richard scoffed from the window. "Mother, this is a farce. It's a birthmark. Millions of people have them. You're projecting a fantasy onto a stranger because of a coincidence." "It is not a coincidence, Richard," Beatrice said, her voice sharp as steel, silencing him instantly. She looked back at Annalise. "This exact mark, in this exact location, has appeared on the women of my maternal line for over 200 years. It is called the sterling dove. My grandmother had it. I have it." Beatrice gracefully pulled back the cuff of her silk blouse, revealing her own wrist. There on her aged skin was the identical mark, a crescent moon with a delicate feather, faded with time but unmistakably the same. Annalise stared, her breath catching in her throat. It was identical. The strange little shape she had always thought was a random quirk of her biology was staring back at her from the arm of one of the wealthiest women in the world. "How is this possible?" Annalise whispered, her mind reeling. "That is what we intend to find out," Beatrice said. "My youngest son, Edward, and his wife, Laura, were lost in a yachting accident 24 years ago off the coast of Montauk. They had an infant daughter with them. Her name was Juliet. The wreckage was found, but their bodies and the babies were never recovered. Juliet would be your age now, Annalise. And her mother, Laura, was my daughter. She had the mark." The implication hung in the air, heavy and unbelievable. Richard let out a short, incredulous laugh. "You can't be serious," he said, turning to face them fully. "You think this waitress, this nobody from a greasy spoon in Queens, is Juliet? Juliet is gone. She died with her parents. This is a pathetic, transparent attempt to swindle you." He glared at Annalise, his eyes filled with undisguised contempt. "Tell me, Miss Parker, how much research did you do? Did you study our family history? Get a tattoo to match? Who put you up to this?" "Richard, that is enough," Beatrice commanded. "No, it's not enough," he shot back, his voice rising. "I will not stand by and watch you be taken in by some grifter. I am the CEO of this company, the steward of this family's legacy. I will not allow it to be jeopardized by your sentimentality." "I don't know anything about this," Annalise said, finding her voice. It came out stronger than she expected. "I didn't ask for any of this until yesterday. I had never heard the name Sterling outside of a headline. I've had this mark my entire life." Beatrice watched the exchange, her expression unreadable. "There is only one way to be certain," she said, her voice cutting through the tension. "We will conduct a DNA test. Dr. Albright, our family physician, will be here within the hour. He will take samples from you, Annalise, and from me. They will be sent to the most reputable lab in the country. The results will be definitive." She turned her piercing gaze on Annalise. "If you are who I believe you might be, your life will change forever. If you are not, we will compensate you generously for your time and trouble, and you will sign a non-disclosure agreement. Are you willing to proceed?" Annalise looked from Beatrice's hopeful yet guarded face to Richard's sneering hostility. She thought of Daniel, of the crushing weight of their life, of the endless shifts and the gnawing fear of the future. Whatever this was, it was a door to a world she couldn't imagine, but also a door that might lead to answers about a past she had never known. Her parents had died in a car crash when she was a baby, or so the orphanage had told her. She had no family, no history, just a scar. "Yes," Annalise said, her voice clear and firm. "I am." Richard Sterling watched her, his eyes narrowing into slits. It was not the answer he wanted, and in his cold, calculating gaze, Annalise saw not just a skeptic, but an enemy. The test would prove the truth, but she had a sinking feeling that, for some people in this gilded cage, the truth was the last thing they wanted to find. The days following the DNA test were a strange, suspended reality for Annalise. At Beatrice's insistence, she remained at Sterling Manor. It was framed as a security measure to protect her from potential media scrutiny should word leak out. But Annalise knew it was also a form of observation. She was a specimen under a microscope. She was given a guest suite that was larger than her entire Queen's apartment, decorated in creams and golds with a 4-poster bed, a marble bathroom, and a private balcony overlooking emerald lawns. A silent housekeeper laid out a wardrobe of new clothes, cashmere sweaters, silk blouses, tailored trousers. The price tag on a single pair of shoes could have covered Daniel's medication for 6 months. The opulence was a constant, dizzying assault. She was allowed to call Daniel once a day, on a secure line provided by the family. She told him a sanitized version of the truth, a temporary, high-paying job as a personal assistant, requiring her to live on site for a few weeks. A trusted neighbor was looking in on him, and she'd wired more than enough money to cover any expenses. Daniel thrilled at her good fortune, and the sudden financial relief eased his worry. The guilt of the lie was a bitter pill each night. Life in the manor was a study in contrast. Beatrice was cautiously warm, inviting Annalise for tea in the conservatory or slow walks through the rose garden, asking gentle questions about her life, her childhood in foster care, her dreams. But she rarely spoke of the past, of her lost daughter, Laura, or her granddaughter, Juliet. It was as if she feared giving the ghost a name, lest it vanish. Annalise sensed a deep, profound grief in the old woman, a wound that had never healed. Richard, on the other hand, was a pillar of ice. He treated Annalise with a venomous disdain, making it clear through clipped remarks and icy glares that he considered her an opportunistic fraud. During family dinners, he steered the conversation toward topics designed to highlight her lack of sophistication: global finance, art auctions, European politics. Annalise would sit in silence, cheeks burning with humiliation, while Richard watched her with a smug, triumphant smirk. His wife, Catherine, remained a timid shadow, speaking only when spoken to, her eyes filled with a weary sadness. The manor itself felt like a living entity, filled with secrets. The staff moved with silent, reverential efficiency, their faces impassive masks. Annalise often felt their eyes on her as she wandered the portrait-lined corridors. Were they curious? Hostile? She couldn't tell. They were as much a part of the house's formidable defenses as the high stone walls and iron gates. One rainy afternoon, driven by restless curiosity, Annalise found herself exploring the West Wing, an area quieter and less used than the rest. At the end of a dusty hallway, she found a door slightly ajar. Peeking inside, she discovered a nursery, frozen in time, a perfect capsule of a life that had never been lived. A carved wooden crib stood in the center of the room, a mobile of silver birds hanging motionless above it. Tiny dresses hung in a glass-fronted wardrobe, and a collection of pristine storybooks sat on a shelf. The room was coated in a thin layer of dust, a silent testament to its abandonment. On a rocking chair in the corner sat a leather-bound book, a photo album. Annalise picked it up, her fingers tracing the faded gold lettering. Our Juliet. Her heart pounded as she opened it. The first pages were filled with wedding photos of a smiling, vibrant couple. The man had the sterling features, but a gentler smile than Richard. Edward. The woman beside him was beautiful, with kind eyes and dark hair. In every photo, she glowed with happiness. A caption identified them. Edward and Laura, June 1989. Annalise's hand trembled as she turned the page. Photos of a pregnant Laura, her face full of joyful anticipation. And then the last photos. Laura in a hospital bed, holding a tiny, swaddled bundle. The baby was red-faced and squinting, but on its tiny forearm, visible as it peeked from the blanket, was a faint, dark mark. Her mark. A sob escaped Annalise's lips. She sank onto the rocking chair, the album clutched to her chest. This was real. These people, this beautiful couple, were her parents. The smiling woman was her mother. The baby was her, Juliet. She was so absorbed in the album that she didn't hear the footsteps in the hall. This wing is kept private. Annalise jumped, startled. A stern-looking woman in a housekeeper's uniform stood in the doorway. Mrs. Davies, who had been with the Sterling family for over 40 years. Her face was a network of disapproving lines. I'm sorry, Annalise stammered, quickly closing the album. The door was open. I didn't mean to intrude. Mrs. Davies's gaze softened ever so slightly as she looked at the album in Annalise's hands. That room has been sealed for 24 years. Mrs. Sterling couldn't bear to look at it. She stepped into the room, her eyes scanning the dusty surfaces. After the tragedy, it was as if a part of this house died. A part of her died. Gaze softened ever so slightly as she looked at the album in Annalise's hands. That room has been sealed for 24 years. Mrs. Sterling couldn't bear to look at it. She stepped into the room, her eyes scanning the dusty surfaces. After the tragedy, it was as if a part of this house died. A part of her died. She must have loved them very much, Annalise said softly. Mr. Edward was her favorite. Mrs. Davies confirmed with a nod. He was not like his father or his brother. He was a gentle soul, an artist. He never cared for the business. All he wanted was his wife and his baby girl. The housekeeper paused, a flicker of an old memory in her eyes. He and Mr. Richard, they never saw eye to eye, especially after Mr. Gregory Sterling, the patriarch, passed away. Mr. Edward wanted to take his inheritance and leave, start a new life away from all this. What happened? Annalise prompted, hungry for any detail. Mr. Richard fought him, of course, said it would weaken the company, dilute the family's power. The arguments were terrible. The week before they left on that boat trip, the fighting was worse than ever. Mrs. Davies seemed to catch herself, realizing she had said too much. Her professional mask slipped back into place. It was a long time ago. Old history. She took the album gently from Annalise's hands and placed it back on the chair. The results of the test are due tomorrow. It is best to wait for the truth to be official before dwelling on ghosts. With that, she ushered Annalise out of the room, firmly closing the door behind them, sealing the past once more. Annalise walked back to her suite, her mind racing. The fight between the brothers, Edward's desire to leave. It added a new, darker layer to the story. The official narrative was a tragic accident, but the whispers in the walls of Sterling Manor hinted at something more complex. A family fractured by ambition and resentment. And at the center of it all was a baby girl who had simply disappeared, a ghost whose name was Juliet. The next day, a heavy, expectant silence fell over the manor. Dr. Albright was scheduled to arrive at 3:30 with the certified results from the laboratory. Annalise spent the morning pacing her room, her stomach a tight knot of anxiety. This was the moment that would either shatter the impossible dream or condemn her to a life she could barely comprehend. Meanwhile, Richard Sterling was not idle. Convinced that Annalise was an imposter, he had on the day of the test hired a man named Vincent Thorne, a discreet but ruthless private investigator known for his ability to unearth secrets people thought were buried forever. Richard's instructions were simple. Find dirt on Annalise Parker. Find a criminal record, a disgruntled ex-boyfriend, a history of scams, anything that would expose her as a fraud and discredit her in Beatrix's eyes. Thorne was exceptionally good at his job. He started by digging into Annalise's sealed juvenile records and her time in the foster care system. He interviewed former foster parents and neighbors, but the picture that emerged was disappointingly clean. She was quiet, hardworking, and fiercely protective of her younger brother. She had no vices, no criminal history, not even a parking ticket. Her life was one of unglamorous, relentless toil. Frustrated, Thorne decided to change tactics. If he couldn't find dirt on Annalise, perhaps he could find inconsistencies in the foundation of her claim. He started investigating her birth. The official story she had been told by the orphanage was that she was a foundling left on the steps of a church in a small town on Long Island, with a note that gave only her first name, Annalise, and a date of birth. Thorne traveled to that town. He pulled the original police report from that night 24 years ago. The report was brief. An anonymous call had alerted the police to a baby left in a basket. The note was logged into evidence. Everything seemed straightforward, but Thorne was a man who noticed details. The date on the police report was October 26th. He cross-referenced it with news archives. The Sterling yacht, the Serenity, had been reported missing on October the 24th, 2 days earlier during a violent, unforecasted storm. The wreckage was discovered on the 27th. The timelines were tight but plausible. However, something else in the archived news reports caught his eye. A small sidebar article mentioned that a local woman had reported her car stolen on the night of the 25th. The car was found abandoned the next morning near the very church where the baby was discovered. The police had deemed it an unrelated local crime. Thorne, however, didn't believe in coincidences. He tracked down the woman who had owned the car. She was now elderly, but she remembered the incident clearly. "Strangest thing," she told him. "They didn't take anything. Just used it, I suppose. Left it clean as a whistle except for one thing. There was sand on the driver's side floor mat, lots of it, and it smelled of salt, like someone had come right off the beach." The beach. Thorne's instincts flared. He went back to the police report about the yacht. It mentioned where the bulk of the wreckage had washed ashore, a desolate private stretch of beach in Montauk, a good 50-mile march from where the baby had been found. He drove to Montauk and spoke with the retired Coast Guard officer who had been in charge of the recovery operation. The old man remembered the Sterling case vividly. "A real tragedy," he said, shaking his head. "That storm came out of nowhere. We searched for days, but the currents out here, they can take a body miles out to sea in a matter of hours. We never stood a chance of finding them." "Did you find anything unusual?" Thorne pressed. "Anything that didn't fit with a standard boating accident?" The officer hesitated. "Well, there was one thing unofficially. The emergency beacon on the yacht was state-of-the-art. It was designed to activate automatically on impact or if submerged. It never went off. We found it in the wreckage. The wiring had been cleanly cut." Thorne felt a jolt. Cut wires. That wasn't the signature of a storm. That was the signature of sabotage. While Thorne was unearthing the skeletons of the past, Annalise was making her own discovery. Unable to bear the waiting, she had been drawn back to the West Wing. The nursery door was now locked, but her exploration had led her to an adjacent room, a small study that must have belonged to her father, Edward. It was filled with art supplies, canvases, and books on art history. In the back of a desk drawer, beneath a stack of old sketchbooks, she found a small locked metal box. After several minutes of fiddling with a hairpin, the lock clicked open. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a collection of letters tied with a ribbon and a small tarnished silver locket. She opened the locket first. On one side was a tiny photo of Edward. On the other, a picture of Laura, her mother. Her hands shaking, she untied the ribbon on the letters. They were not from Edward, but to him. The handwriting was an elegant looping script. She read the first one. "Dearest Edward, I must write to you, though I know you will tell me I am being paranoid. I cannot shake this feeling of dread. The air in this house has grown so cold since your father passed. Your brother watches me. He watches us. He sees Laura and the baby not as family, but as threats to what he believes is his birthright. He speaks of preserving the legacy. But I hear only greed in his voice. He resents your desire to leave, resents that your share of the inheritance would go with you. Be careful, my dear boy. Power makes monsters of men, and this family is built on power. Yours in loyalty and concern, Fiona." Annalise's blood ran cold. She quickly read through the other letters. They were all from this Fiona, and they painted a chilling picture. A picture of Richard's escalating resentment of his arguments with Edward, growing more vicious. The final letter was dated October 22nd, just before the fateful boat trip. "Edward, he knows you are planning to leave after the trip. I overheard him on the phone with the family lawyers asking hypothetical questions about what would happen to your shares if you were to die without a will. I am terrified. Do not go on that boat. I beg you. Take Laura and Juliet and leave now tonight. Disappear. Your brother is not the man you think he is. I fear he is his father's son, in all the worst ways. Please listen to me. Fiona." Who was Fiona? Annalise frantically searched through the sketchbooks, hoping for a clue. Near the back of one, she found a charcoal portrait of a woman with sharp, intelligent eyes and a severe hairstyle. The caption underneath read, "Fiona, Juliet's governess. The only one I trust. The governess." Mrs. Davies had mentioned that the family had hired a highly recommended governess for the baby, a woman who had mysteriously disappeared right after the accident, never to be heard. From again, Annalise sat on the floor of the dusty study, the letters spread around her, the locket clutched in her hand. The story of a tragic accident was a lie. These letters were a warning from the grave. This wasn't just a matter of inheritance, it was a matter of potential murder. And the man who stood to gain the most, the man who had looked at her with such hatred from the moment she arrived, was his brother, Richard. At that moment, the chiming of the grandfather clock in the hall echoed through the silent manor. It was 3:00. Dr. Albright had arrived. The truth was waiting for her downstairs. But Annalise now realized there was more than one truth to be found. One was in a sealed envelope from a lab. The other was buried in 24 years of lies, and it was far more dangerous. The atmosphere in the drawing room was electric with tension. Beatrice sat ramrod straight in her armchair, her face an inscrutable mask. Richard stood by the fireplace, radiating a palpable aura of hostility. Catherine was a ghost on the sofa, wringing her hands in her lap. Annalise stood near the door, the weight of the letters she'd found, feeling like a physical burden in her pocket. Dr. Albright, a kind-faced man in his 60s, entered carrying a large sealed manila envelope. He cleared his throat, his professional demeanor doing little to ease the suffocating tension. "Good afternoon," he began, addressing Beatrice. "I have the certified results from the diagnostics laboratory. They are conclusive." He opened the envelope and pulled out a multi-page report. He scanned it for a moment before looking up, his eyes finding Annalise. "The mitochondrial DNA analysis shows a direct, unbroken maternal link between you, Beatrice, and you, Annalise. He announced the probability of you being the daughter of Laura Sterling, and therefore Beatrice's granddaughter is 99%. Congratulations. Annalise Parker is without any scientific doubt Juliet Sterling." A collective breath was released in the room. Catherine let out a small, tearful gasp and put a hand to her mouth. Beatrice closed her eyes and a single silent tear traced a path down her cheek. She reached out a trembling hand towards Annalise. "Juliet," she whispered the name finally given voice. Richard's reaction was volcanic. "No, it's impossible. The test is wrong. She bribed someone." "This is a fraud," he bellowed, his face turning a blotchy red. "The test is incontrovertible, Richard," Dr. Albright said sternly. "The lab is the most secure in the country. The chain of custody was perfect. This result is legally and scientifically binding." "I don't care," Richard spat, turning his fury on Annalise. "You think you've won, don't you? You think you can just walk in here and claim a part of what my family has built over generations? I will fight you. I will drag your name through the mud. I will prove what you are." "Richard, that is enough." Beatrice's voice cracked like a whip. She rose to her feet, her grief-stricken vulnerability replaced by the steely authority of the Sterling matriarch. "You will welcome your niece into this family, or you will find yourself on the outside of it. Juliet is home. That is the end of the discussion." Richard stared at his mother, his chest heaving, his eyes burning with a mixture of hatred and disbelief. Without another word, he turned on his heel and stormed out of the room, slamming the heavy oak doors behind him. The confirmation of her identity should have been a moment of pure triumph for Annalise or Juliet, as she now had to think of herself. But the discovery of the letters had poisoned it. As Beatrice embraced her weeping, with a joy that was 24 years in the making, Annalise felt a chilling sense of dread. She was embracing a woman whose own son may have orchestrated the death of her other child. Richard, however, was not a man to accept defeat. His plan to discredit Annalise had failed, so he moved to a more aggressive strategy: containment and sabotage. His first call was not to his lawyers, but to Vincent Thorne. The DNA was a match. Richard snarled into the phone. "The old woman has lost her mind. She's changing her will. The girl stands to inherit Edward's entire original share. Held in trust. It's a fortune." "What about my findings?" Thorne asked, his voice calm and professional. "The cut wires on the beacon, the stolen car." "This wasn't an accident, Mr. Sterling." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "That is a complication," Richard said finally, his voice dangerously low. "A complication that needs to be buried. Your investigation is over. You will destroy your files. You will forget into everything you found. Your final payment will reflect your permanent discretion." Thorne was a pragmatist, but he was also a man with a sliver of a conscience. He had uncovered a potential murder, and now his client was telling him to bury it. He knew exactly what that implied. "Understood, Mr. Sterling," he said, but he had no intention of destroying his files. Richard's next move was to isolate Annalise. He began a subtle but vicious campaign within the family and the company. He spread rumors that Annalise was unstable, that her years in the foster system had left her damaged and greedy. He instructed the household staff to watch her every move, reporting back to him. Annalise began to feel like a prisoner in the opulent mansion, her newfound grandmother's affection, a fragile shield against her uncle's relentless hostility. He tried to frame her. One evening, a valuable Faber egg went missing from a display cabinet in the library. Richard immediately accused Annalise, demanding her room be searched. The staff under his orders conducted a thorough search. Annalise stood mortified as they went through her belongings. The egg, of course, was not there. It was found hours later by Mrs. Davis, tucked away behind a book on a different shelf, a place it could have easily been misplaced. But the damage was done. The seed of doubt had been planted among the staff, and Annalise feared, even in Beatrix's mind. The serpent was striking, trying to poison her newfound life before it could even begin. Annalise knew she couldn't fight him alone. She had Fiona's letters. But who was Fiona? A ghost from the past. She needed more. She needed the man who had dug up the truth and then been told to bury it. Using the small burner phone she had kept from her old life, she did some research. Richard Sterling was a man of habit. His financial records showed a recurring payment to Thorne Investigations. It didn't take her long to find a number. She took a deep breath and made the call, retreating to the far end of the rose garden for privacy. "Thorne," a gruff voice answered. "My name is Annalise Parker or Juliet Sterling," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "I believe you were hired by my uncle Richard Sterling to investigate me." There was a moment of silence. "That's confidential client information. I know what you found." She pressed on her voice, gaining strength. "I know you found out the yacht accident wasn't an accident. I have letters from my governess, Fiona, warning my father about Richard. He told you to bury it, didn't he?" Another pause, longer this time. "You're playing a dangerous game, Miss Sterling." "Richard is the one playing a dangerous game," she retorted. "He tried to frame me for theft. I don't know what he's capable of, but I think he's responsible for my parents' deaths, and I think he'll do anything to keep his secret. I need your help. I need to find Fiona." Thorne was silent for nearly a minute. He was weighing the risk. Crossing a man like Richard Sterling could end his career or worse. But this young woman had courage, and she had evidence. Combined with his own findings, it was a powerful combination. Finding a ghost who has been hiding for 24 years is not easy. "Or cheap," he said finally. "My grandmother just set up a trust for me." "I can pay you whatever you ask," Annalise replied without hesitation. "It's not about the money anymore," Thorne said, a note of grim determination in his voice. "Richard Sterling made a mistake when he told me to bury a murder. Send me copies of those letters. I'll find your governess." As Annalise hung up the phone, she looked back at the magnificent stone mansion. It was her home, now her birthright, but it was also a viper's nest. Richard had struck at her and missed. She knew his next strike would be harder and more deadly. Finding Fiona was no longer just about understanding the past. It was about surviving the present. Vincent Thorne, a master of finding ghosts, began his search for Fiona Maud. He discovered the governess had been placed by a high-end agency, and after tracking down its retired owner, found her only emergency contact, a cousin in Vermont. The cousin was wary until Thorne showed her a photo of Annalise, her sterling dove birthmark clearly visible. Recognizing the proof, Fiona had told her to wait for the woman, revealed the truth. Fiona was alive, living in quiet fear under an assumed name, in a secluded cottage in Maine. Armed with this knowledge, Annalise knew she could not act alone. She went to Beatrix and laid out the entire conspiracy. Fiona's warning letters, Thorne's discovery of the sabotage beacon, and the fact that the governess was alive. The matriarch was horrified. The potential betrayal of her son, a monstrous thought. But beneath her grief, the sterling steel hardened. She would not allow the family's legacy to be built upon such a devastating lie. The confrontation was staged with cold precision in the manor's grand library. Beatrix summoned Richard for an urgent family meeting, knowing his paranoia and greed would ensure his attendance. As Richard strode in radiating arrogance, a side door opened. An elderly woman with haunted eyes was escorted into the room. It was Fiona Maud. Richard's face went white with shock. "You," he breathed as if seeing a specter. "Hello, Richard," Fiona said, her voice trembling but clear. "It has been a long time." Ignoring his blustering accusations, she began her story at Beatrix's command. She recounted the terrible arguments between Richard and Edward, explaining that Edward had uncovered their father Gregory's criminal dealings and planned to use them as leverage to leave the family peacefully. Richard saw it not as leverage, Fiona explained, but as a threat to the entire Sterling legacy. Her voice dropped to a whisper as she described seeing Richard near the yacht with a tool bag the night before the fateful trip. She told them of the safe deposit box Edward had entrusted to her, filled with cash and incriminating documents, along with a final desperate plea: "Protect my daughter. Don't let my family raise her." Fiona then tearfully confessed to her desperate flight and the heartbreaking decision to leave the infant Juliet on a church's steps. The only way she knew to keep the child safe and truly free from the family's corrupting influence. As her story concluded, Thorne stepped forward, corroborating her account with his own findings. The cleanly cut wires on the emergency beacon. The pieces formed a monstrous image, and all eyes fell on Richard. "It was not an accident, was it, Richard?" Beatrice's voice was unnervingly soft. She accused him not of active murder, but of a colder sin, knowing their father's secrets, knowing Edward was a threat, and simply letting him sail into a deadly storm. His crime was a calculated, ambitious silence. Richard's denials crumbled under the weight of the truth. He didn't confess with words, but with a single defeated slump of his shoulders. He sank into a chair, a king exposed in his own crumbling castle, finally broken by a secret that had refused to stay buried. The aftermath of the confession was not a storm, but a quiet, crushing collapse. Choosing a private justice over a public scandal, Beatrice stripped Richard of his power. He was removed as CEO and exiled to a remote property. His punishment, a life of irrelevance, a fate worse than prison for a man defined by his ambition. The Sterling fortune was radically restructured. Beatrice and Annalise established the Edward and Laura Sterling Foundation, a massive charitable trust dedicated to the arts. A significant portion of the estate was placed in a personal trust for Juliet Sterling, granting her the independence her father had always wanted. Annalise, still Annalise in soul, rejected high society. Her first act was not to indulge in luxury, but to secure the nation's best medical specialists for her brother Daniel. His health rapidly improved, and seeing him breathe easily was her greatest reward. Together they started a new life grounded in normalcy rather than opulence. She forged a delicate healing bond with Beatrice built on shared grief and redemption. From Fiona Maloud, she received the gift of memory, learning about the kind parents she never knew. One afternoon, Annalise looked at the silvery mark on her forearm. The sterling dove had been a map leading her through a labyrinth of lies to a liberating truth. It had brought her home not to the cold stone of a mansion, but to a future she could forge on her own terms. One where the sterling legacy would be redefined by compassion, not by the sins of the past. Annalise's journey shows us that truth, no matter how deeply buried, has a way of coming to the surface. It reminds us that family is not just about blood or a name, but about the choices we make and the love we fight to protect. Her scar was not a flaw, but a key that unlocked her past and freed her future. What began in a humble diner ended with the transformation of a dynasty, proving that one person's courage can rewrite history. What did you think of Annalise's incredible story? Was Beatrix's form of justice for Richard the right choice? Or should he have faced legal consequences? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story of secrets, betrayal, and ultimate redemption moved you, please give this video a thumbs up, share it with someone who loves a powerful drama, and don't forget to subscribe for more unforgettable real-life stories.